Hi, and welcome back to the Mob Mentality Show. I'm Chris Lucian, and my co-host is Austin Chadwick. And today we're going to talk a little bit about 100% extreme ownership in a mob. So, Austin, what are your thoughts on such a subject?
Yes. So see our prior episodes on extreme ownership and also the virtuous loop, which extreme ownership is a part of. So I believe the virtuous loop, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, is retrospectives, extreme ownership plus dedicated learning time. Do I win any brownie points or gold stars?
There we go.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. Um, and so something that kind of comes up is like how extreme is the ownership? Is it
Mm.
extreme? Is it 100%? Is it 98? Um, so at least in our current context, multiple mobs, see previous episodes on multi-mobbing too, um, uh, will be working, in and around the same repos or related repos and things like that. So they're largely independent. Um, but there can be times where there's impact from one to the other. And I've seen it come up where, um, you know, there's this dichotomy in the mob, let's say. Some people want to, before we decide and do something, they want to go out and talk to all the other mobs, whether it's one or many or the whole department, whole subset of 20, 10 mobs, let's say. And then there's other people who are more like, no, we're the whole system in the room. We decide it, we do it. We don't need to introduce additional, uh, you know, uh, handoffs or lean wastes by asking outside the current mob, right? And so the thing that you could be want to do, that could be in question is, for example, trying a new technology stack or, switching from one language A to language B. Let's say the first three lambdas, serverless functions were done in one language, and they're like, oh, for the fourth one, let's do it in another language. Or sometimes I've seen it with refactoring stylistic things. So one mob, it leans more or less towards more extractions, and another mob doesn't. And it's like, well, the other mob may not like it, so we should talk to them first. Or it's like, no, we have authority, we have autonomy. Let's go refactor it how we see is best. So what would be your advice in this situation? To this kind of debate that happens internally in a mob. And I guess it could happen even if you're not mobbing, just amongst teams. How far do you reach out for feedback before you do a thing?
Oh, yeah. Well, also, I guess, see the episode on the inverse Conway maneuver and Conway's law, right?
Hmm.
Um, so my opinion, I've kind of grown on this over the years too, where it's like, um, I think I've seen, more interdependencies and more communication load happen. And so that's why I've been so big on the Conway's law and inverse Conway maneuver lately, is because reducing the number of teams that have to interact with a repo, I think is kind of a virtuous thing, so to speak, in the sense that you will, if that team can deploy, to their production environment independently of other teams, then that ends up being really good. In that example of like the refactoring war, where one team thinks refactoring it one way is better, and the other team thinks the refactoring is another way is better. Um, that could in of itself be wasteful if you just create additional file churn. Um, so, generally, I think my suggestion there would be that one of the teams owns the repo and everybody refactors to the style that the owner likes. And so, regardless of what your preference is just be kind of respectful of who owns that repo, so to speak, or which team owns that repo. So, if they're underway with a large refactoring, you know, uh, process, and then you go in and refactor it differently for that one piece when you're just jumping in there, that could be dangerous. But the better option would be to have APIs for the systems to communicate with each other, but you don't want to introduce additional weighting either. So there will be shared projects here and there. If you think about like the people on that work on Microsoft Office 365, right? So Word and Excel, those teams probably don't have to talk to each other very much. But the people that make the waffle to choose between Word and Excel need to know the APIs that are responsible for, getting there at the very least. So it's a very simplistic example, but and so those teams have a dependence on that other team, or they if they both own a portion of that repo, then they have to collaborate, right? So my thought and Joe Justice also, I've been watching some of his talks in Japan, and one of the things he was talking about was his Justice's Law, which is the maximum number of parallel items at the same time. And so to maximize parallel items, you need to make the pieces of the team that they're responsible for interchangeable to the point where they're agreed upon interfaces, and then everything inside can be continuous delivery. And he's talking about hardware, but um, so that's a long-winded answer, I guess, to the to the question.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, so I mean, it's fascinating because I think we might have some debate here, which might be fun.
yeah,
So I agree with the goal of reducing churn, right? And so I think, but one thing we might disagree on is, does the inverse Conway's maneuver introduce its own lean waste? At least some ways it can be impacted. And does it go against kind of the collective ownership of XP? Right? So you stake out, carve some code out, and you stake it. It is owned by team. Let's just call them Team Pirates. They sound rowdy, and I wouldn't want to mess with them. Maybe the pirates own this piece of code, right? They are the official owners, and you cannot make changes unless you go through them. And so the question comes up, does that require kind of foreknowledge on what the business needs, right? So for example, if for every repo there is an official owner and you must stay within your boundaries. Well, what if what the business wants to work on is the most important thing, has nothing to do with that repo, and it's in these other repos? And so do the pirates just hang around doing nothing, waiting for important work to do? Um, or if, let's say, they're the owner of a very popular repo that lots of people depend on, how do they just queue up and wait because they're like, well, we need to make this change. Maybe it's a shared component. You were talking about something in the waffle,
yeah,
but this one other team owns it, so we're gonna wait and we're gonna work on something else, not the most important thing, because they are the owners of it.
yeah,
And so, what are your thoughts there?
yeah. Well, so the ownership should represent vertical slices, right? So front end all the way to back end, all the way to database, and so on. If it's something that is really, really popular, figuring out how to split it up, right? So there was one repo that we had that was shared by a lot of different teams. And so we kind of, for the inverse Conway maneuver, we instituted a rule saying no one except this team is allowed to commit to that repo. And so everybody said, well,
Mhm.
I can't deploy into my project if I don't. Like, okay, well, then how do you build it so that it is a micro front end so that you don't have that problem? You can deploy and they can deploy independently of each other. So the
Mhm.
other team went and made a completely independent pipeline, made a micro front end, and in that micro front end, created all of the UI, and then worked with that team to just integrate that micro front end. So now they can deploy as often as they want. Their portion of the app updates completely independently of the original. And so no, they never wait, right? But they are able to deploy independently. But they were highly dependent on each other before, right? And if one broke the pipeline, then the other one would have to wait to deploy, or other things like that. There was all kinds of waiting being introduced by other things happening. Failing test gets committed or something along those lines. Um, and so by kind of creating that simple rule of be able to deploy and don't touch that repo anymore, then there's a bunch of stuff you have to build in infrastructure all of a sudden, but the end result is way better because now there's a lot less waiting, a lot less lean wastes in general. And so it's like, how can you divide up the product in such a way that you do that. And sometimes that might mean a plugin architecture or a dynamic UI or micro front ends, but something where you can own the entire stack for your portion of the application.
Yeah, and I guess my question would be, one thing I really liked about that, and then maybe I'll ask a clarification question first, is that the boundaries between what can be what I'll just put it this way, what can be touched and what cannot be touched, those should be flexible. Those
Right.
aren't in stone, right? And so those
Absolutely.
change as the needs change, right? And so I think I guess what I've seen and or heard before is some architect or manager decides boundaries, and then those are edicts for all time in the future, right? And so
Right.
where it sounds like what you're talking about is let's change the boundaries, let's refactor the boundaries, even as we discover and learn more where those boundaries should be, right? So that we can be completely independent. Okay.
Yeah. So I believe so my obsession with the inverse Conway maneuver lately has been because I think the communication structure of the team, given Conway's law, resulted in a monolithic architecture.
Hmm.
And and so the inverse Conway maneuver was like, you're not allowed to commit to the monolith anymore. Good luck, right? And and so
Yeah.
then almost immediately the communication structure. So those teams stopped having meetings as much together. They started getting a lot more development time, and the
Hmm.
boundaries of the application shifted. And some of
Gotcha.
it is still combined, right? But it's being deployed in such a way that if that team ever gets blocked by the team that owns the repo,
Hmm.
then they own the pipeline. Sorry, individual owners of pipelines really. If the pipeline stops them from deploying, then and they
Yes.
can't work at all anymore,
Yep.
then their top priority is to be building a independent pipeline.
Nice.
Right.
Yeah. And I think what I'll throw out there is maybe I'll say it slightly leaner implementation of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Maybe less bells and whistles, but without staking in the ground official ownership, can't you just do what you said? If I'm dependent on this other team and I shouldn't be, just make my own independence without saying
Right.
they're officially in charge of this and we're officially in charge of that. I've seen that happen before where they're like, okay, we need to do a thing and we don't want to be dependent on this or that. Then they make, like you said, their own thin vertical slice path with CI/CD to what they need to get done without having an official conversation about who owns what. Uh,
Right. Yeah. And again, I think the main thing is that if you're working on a monolith, it is just super tempting to keep committing to that monolith.
mhm.
And it's super tempting to have all of the same organizational habits of like, oh, you blocked the pipeline, like we're mad at you. Go wear the dunce cap because the pipeline's down. All these like all of this weird kind of interpersonal interactions that come from co-ownership of a pipeline that might not be kind, considerate, or respectful. Um, and so I think habitually, uh, sometimes people will do exactly what you said and create an independent workflow. But what I'm suggesting is that uh, sometimes you have to kind of talk with everybody and say, we need to split this up because we are having to talk to each other too much. So like I know we love communication and we promote that, but at some level, everybody being in the know for everything is very challenging. Um,
Mm.
and so for people that prefer to have everybody involved, um, once if you look at all the different combinations of communication and kind of the theory behind Conway's law, you'll find that um, you may end up with like 64 different edges of communication. Everybody has to understand each other and they have to talk to each other for like,
Yeah.
12 people or something. And
Yes.
so I agree with you. I think that making your own independent pipeline on your own is a good thing. But if you find yourself in a habitual, like, we're going to have a 45-minute stand up because 12 people need to align with each other, um, that's when you can say, hey, stop the line, inverse Conway maneuver. This team owns that. These teams, if you get blocked by them, build your own pipeline. Let's go and do it. Um, And it was I think everybody involved in that scenario had to restructure their thinking about what it meant to contribute to the project.
Yeah, and I think yeah, I like all that. And I guess I've seen in maybe my last, it's hard to guarantee I won't respond to what you're about to say, but might be my last thought to throw in here would be, is it really the monolith that's the problem, or is it just independence and deployability and lean communications? So, for example, I've had many happy at times in a monolith with multiple mobs touching it, but the confidence was high that we didn't need to talk to them, right?
Right.
The change we're making, we're 99.9% certain doesn't break anything they're doing because of our fast unit tests, and it just extends or adds behavior in some way, right? Um, and so, is the enemy really the monolith, or is it just independent deployability? Like you can have all the same virtues of separation of concerns within a monolith with slightly harder boundaries, or slightly less harder boundaries versus, I guess that kind of goes back to your flexibility thing, right? To redraw the boundaries of a repo or a microservice takes more time than in a monolith. It's really easy for me to, like, even let's just say it's a ball of spaghetti, to pull something out of the monolith, even keep it in the same repo, but then make it, certain that I'm not breaking or dependent upon anything else in a bad way. And do I need to turn that into a microservice and a micro front end and all these, gadgets and widgets, gadgets and widgets? That's not a real word. Uh,
Making stuff up now.
yeah, yeah. Now
Uh,
I'm making stuff up. I guess my question is the monolith really the enemy, or is it some other dependency boundary? Yeah.
well, so again, I think I'm going back to more human behavior and Conway's law. And
Okay.
and so for me, this is more of a question of whether or not people feel safe contributing.
Okay.
And if so yes, um you could decouple, right? And then you can be like, I'm sure the pipeline's not going to block me, right?
Yeah.
But you really can't guarantee that that another team has the same virtues that your team does.
Mm.
And so, if you are only in a position to say I'm going to act on myself and not others, um, then yes, you can operate that way. But if you're kind of at a high level seeing a large systematic problem, like, for example, every change requires everyone to be involved because everything is breakable and no one feels safe, then that might be a time to consider the inverse Conway maneuver. And, I think like the really quick litmus test is, if you have a stand up and multiple teams have to hear everything from the other team's stand up, um, then, because there is risk involved for everyone, then that might be a good time to think about doing an inverse Conway maneuver on that team.
Gotcha. 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 Yeah, and I think I might be bleeding into yet another of our previous episodes. Nothing matters except XP.
Right.
Because and if they're not doing XP, yeah, they're not going to be safe, no matter what Conway magic
You can argue
we
with people in
rich,
the comments about that. Yeah.
yeah, no matter what rituals and wands we wave over the teams with
Right.
these boundaries. So, yes, awesome. Yeah, yeah. Any other thoughts before we close this one down?
I know it's a good topic. So,
Yeah.
yeah. For everybody that wants to argue with us or confirm anything that we've said here, please join us in the comments. Like, subscribe, share, and more, and we'll see you all next time. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thank you.